In the early 2000s, UK music was under the influence of a force of nature, and that force of nature's name was Craig David. Craig David was an R&B singer, sometimes over garage beats, and he had the voice of an angel, and he dominated in the early 2000s. He won quite a lot of awards. He could probably have won more if Robbie Williams wasn't around at the same time, also releasing bangers. So I understand that Craig may have been a bit underappreciated in retrospect, but still, he was a big deal. People from the UK will know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not sure if Americans will, but he had so many bangers, like 7 Days, Fill Me In, the one about the what's your flavour, tell me what's your flavour, and the video was like a Willy Wonka theme thing. Craig David did some wacky stuff, and it all worked perfectly. He was a cheeky young man from Southampton town, and he was just really good. Like, I just can't... It didn't age well though, and the reason it didn't age well was primarily because of a show named Bo Selector. Bo Selector, which also hasn't aged well, was a very trashy, kind of offensive humour type show, but some of it was funny, but some of it you can't really laugh at these days because it's gone a bit... It was very risque. And one of the things that would happen on Bo Selector is that the host would dress up as various different celebrities and mock them. So you had him dressing as Michael Jackson, Mel B from the Spice Girls, but arguably his most famous parody was that of Craig David. And one of the things about these impressions was that they in no way resembled the celebrities they were mocking. I mentioned how Craig David was from Southampton, whereas the Bo Selector version of Craig David was from Leeds. Craig David, I've done it, I've done the thing, damn it, I promised myself I wasn't going to do it. And basically he transformed Craig David and the public's notion of Craig David into something that Craig David was not. And as Craig David's relevance faded away in the music world, the impression of Craig David lived on far longer. And in the years since, I mean, I think Craig David's admitted, in fact, possibly, that he was actually quite bothered by it. It affected his career a lot. It didn't turn out that well for Craig David. Done it again. And then, a few years ago, in the sort of mid to late 2010s, something magical happened. Because after being just a force of R&B nature in the early 2000s, some 15 or so years later, suddenly, Craig David made his return, and enough time had passed, and the public's perception had shifted just enough, and it had been long ago enough since the whole Bo Selector thing, that actually it was exactly what we needed. We didn't realise it until it happened, but the nation needed Craig David to return. And return he did. He guest appeared on Radio 1 Extra. There's a video of it online where he's just doing Fill Me In, one of his best songs in my opinion. And everyone just goes mad because they're like, wow, this is crazy. They remixed it with a Justin Bieber track. It sounds a lot worse than it actually was. It was actually very, very good indeed. And suddenly Craig David was back on the map, or at least that's the first time I remember hearing about him again for the first time since I was a little boy. And since then, the sky's really been the limit for Craig David in the past few years. He's arguably even surpassed the level he was at back in his heyday. He's also really jacked now. He's clearly been to the gym quite a lot, and he's been on tracks with the likes of Big Nasty, a very relevant UK grime artist, and also KSI, who for all intents and purposes is possibly the most famous person in the UK right now who's not a member of the royal family. So we're talking about somebody who changed the game when he first came around, then dropped off dramatically, and then against all odds, when nobody could really believe it, came back and enjoyed a sparkling renaissance. Now we're going to talk about ECW, the Craig David of professional wrestling. Yes, welcome back to my greatest of series, where we're going to be talking about some things that I believe are the greatest examples of a certain thing in the world of pro wrestling. We're back on shows this week, and I'm going to talk about ECW One Night Stand 2005. We're going to break it down into 5 separate categories, and let's waste no further time. Let's get straight on with category number 1. Reason number 1, in fact, and that is that it was totally different. I don't just mean the original ECW, but that was totally different as well. Obviously, everybody's talked about it so much, but if you were unaware somehow, it changed wrestling forever, and arguably spawned the Attitude Era. In an industry largely built on boring things like respect and tradition, they tore up the rulebook completely, for better and for worse as well, creating for themselves an incredibly passionate fan base, and also creating an insane number of iconic moments that have since gone down in wrestling history, especially insane when you realise there was such a small promotion to do so. But the absolute impact and the absolute cult following that ECW had in the 90s, well, that puts a lot of pressure on a reunion show, doesn't it? Would this show be good? Would it stand out still? Or would it sell out and not properly represent the values of the original ECW? Would ECW One Night Stand be a success if the first one had happened today? I would suggest no. I think the product has moved too far from what it was when ECW was at its peak, and I think that nowadays in WWE the atmosphere is a bit too sterile, a bit too clean, and I just think that ECW couldn't possibly exist in that environment. I just don't think that they'd allow it, really. And that's why I think the timing of One Night Stand 2005 helped make it so different. It stood out so much, but not too much. And that's one of the reasons why it's so great. I mean, realistically, this wasn't too far removed in 2005 from the end of the Attitude Era, all things relative, of course. This event took place not long before the Custody of Dominic ladder match. Well done, Dominic, he's doing really well now, of course. And it took place not long before the incredibly controversial Muhammad Hassan angle with The Undertaker. So there were still wacky, weird, and very, very controversial things going on in WWE at the time. It was nowhere near the product that it is today. I'd argue that the Ruthless Aggression Era was far more similar to the Attitude Era than it was to modern day wrestling, even if it was a bit of a transition between the two. But with that being said, even though it may have had some similarities with the Attitude Era, the Ruthless Aggression Era was not the Attitude Era, of course. It was indeed moving WWE towards a cleaner future, even though this was before PG kicked in. You still had these future stars that would become associated with non-Attitude Era wrestling. John Cena, for example, and Batista were the two main big champions at the time. And that's another reason why this event stood out so differently, which is a reason why it was so great. Because yes, the Ruthless Aggression Era may have been crazier than we thought at the time, because we were still remembering the Attitude Era from a few years prior, but it wasn't as crazy as ECW. ECW felt so rock and roll by comparison. The poster, I love the poster for One Night Stand 2005, if Owen just throws out a picture of it on the screen now, because it's just plain black. It's like a band t-shirt. It's not like the posters that WWE put out. So that's the base reason why One Night Stand 2005 was so great, because it was different for the time, but not so different that it was alien. It was still reminiscent of something not that far in the past, and it came around just long enough after the original ECW had ended. But now we need to talk about the show itself, and you might be thinking, hang on Jack, One Night Stand 2005 wasn't really a great wrestling show. Yes, just as a pure wrestling event, One Night Stand 2005 was kind of sloppy. Kind of all the way through as well, really. I mean, the matches that you'd expect to really carry the work rate for the show, such as Rey Mysterio versus Psychosis and Chris Benoit versus Eddie Guerrero, they didn't really deliver. They were arguably the most disappointing matches on the entire card. And if you look at a show and you think, well, they're going to be the good matches in the show, and then those matches don't deliver, 9 times out of 10 that show's not going to be good, is it? But that's why One Night Stand 2005 isn't your traditional great wrestling pay-per-view. We need to look at other factors here, and that's why reason number 2 why it's one of the greatest pay-per-views of all time, in my opinion, is the nostalgia factor. Whether you liked ECW or not during its initial run, one thing you have to concede is the fact that it created an insane amount of iconic characters. And if it didn't create them, it would still incorporate iconic characters from elsewhere in the wrestling landscape. And so many of these iconic characters were squeezed into One Night Stand 2005, which, by the way, rattles along at a breakneck pace. And the astounding and slightly scary thing is, this was kind of a fraction of the iconic characters ECW could have used if everything was perfect in a perfect world. But a lot of people missed out for various different reasons. Some were injured, some had fallen out of favour, some were just not going to be touched by WWE. And even despite those limitations, this show featured a staggering lineup of nostalgia-based acts. What I'm saying is nostalgia for the old ECW. I'm not saying they were has-beens. Even at the start of the show, it's opened by Joey Styles, who is so intrinsically linked with ECW. ECW. He is joined on commentary by Mick Foley, rocking a Cactus Jack t-shirt to really harken back to that ECW era where he was so beloved and also hated. You've got matches like Chris Jericho, who's using his whole Lionheart moniker, versus his old tag partner Lance Storm, and Lance Storm's new edgy ECW friends that he ditched Jericho for run in to help him later on in the match. You've got matches that represent ECW's often overlooked junior or cruiserweight style of wrestling as well, which kind of gets buried underneath all the hardcore stuff they did, like the match between Little Guido, Tajiri and Super Crazy. You've got a lot on this show that really does bring back a lot of memories. You've also got Sabu beating Rhino with the help of his old tag team partner and friend and foe, they kind of hate each other at the same time, Rob Van Dam. RVD is one of those wrestlers who could not be on the show due to injury, but he still showed up in his own kind of special way. We're going to talk about Rob Van Dam's involvement a little bit later on in this video, but first I do need to dedicate the entirety of point number 3 to arguably the best and arguably the worst match on the entire card. Point number 3, and again one of the reasons that this show is one of the greatest of all time, is Mike Awesome versus Masato Tanaka. Awesome and Tanaka, of course, had a legendary rivalry during ECW's heyday, and sometimes things don't need to be too complicated in wrestling booking. They just said, why not go at it again for one more round? No real build, as far as I can remember anyway. Let me know in the comments if you remember any sort of build to this match, but I think they just said, we'll take him. They've always hated each other. Let's just have them try and kill each other once again. And these guys really try to do damage to each other. I wish that I had the trust in anyone in my life that Awesome and Tanaka clearly had for each other as professional wrestlers, because they throw some insane stuff at one another. Not like 2 minutes into the match, Mike Awesome has grabbed Tanaka and is powerbombing him while running off the apron through a table on the outside. It's sickening, it's scary, it's disgusting. It only gets worse from there. You've got Tanaka reversing an Awesome superplex attempt with kind of a leaping, swinging DDT through again a table, and Awesome nearly lands on his neck. One of about 3 instances in this match where he does appear indeed to land on his neck, and once again, it's absolutely horrifying. And the match continues. You've got Awesome getting revenge on Tanaka with a similar high spot where he stands with him on the top rope and goes to powerbomb him and leaps backwards into the ring and powerbombs him as they're falling backwards, which is insane. What a feat of strength, and what a scary thing to do to somebody as well. Surely that's the end of the match. No. The match rumbles on. And then you've got the finish where Awesome powerbombs Tanaka clean over the top rope. Horrifying scenes once again, and then with the camera not really following him, he just comes out of nowhere with a big dive over the top as well and lands vertically like a spike down on the outside, and presumably on Tanaka, who's kind of out of view in the wreckage of the table. And finally, that is enough to end an absolute war of a wrestling match. Awesome then powerbombs the referee for no reason and walks off. Everybody's happy, but not everybody's happy, because at this point you've got the main roster WWE guys up in the balcony mocking everything that's going on. The biggest culprit, of course, was JBL. What a surprise, who would have thought that? And apparently, and this is, I'm not saying this for certain, but I've read in places that he was legitimately getting drunk during this show. And that might explain why he was being so obnoxious potentially, or it could just be because it's JBL. But all throughout this match, JBL is mocking every single near fall, because yes, this wasn't a match for the purists. Yes, it didn't make total sense. It was an entire spot fest, and both guys were kicking out of stuff that they really shouldn't have been kicking out of, because it devalues everything else on the show. I understand the theory behind it, but man, what a match it was. Doesn't stop JBL from mocking it openly. He's doing like big fake kickouts with his shoulder, going, oh my god, he's going to kick out, oh he did, oh my god, and the rest are all egging him on as well. And this leads us to point number 4, which is a bit of an unusual one. Reason number 4 why this show is one of the greatest ever, and it's maybe not even necessarily a positive thing, but it certainly heightened the tension, is the very real animosity present on that night. And that's because, in a possibly quite clever decision, which backfired in some ways, WWE decided to put SmackDown and then shortly afterwards Raw superstars up on the balcony watching the show and basically drawing the ire of the entire Hammerstein ballroom. You've got Kurt Angle cutting a hilarious heelish promo and JBL I think, cutting a promo, but really just expressing his own thoughts on the great masses below him. And really, the heat is very legitimate. The fans hate these WWE guys, you know, they're loyalists, they're ECW through and through. And then you've got RVD, who of course helped Sabu win his match against Rhino, but that was not his most important contribution to this event. That would have been his in-ring promo. It's a very successful promo from Rob Van Dam, and maybe part of that is because he shoots a little bit. One of the best things he says in the promo, and if you've seen it you'll know exactly the line I'm talking about, is when he's talking about how he's different now and how he's changed and how hopefully he's reminding us of an old RVD before his vocabulary was limited to cool and dude and all that sort of stuff. What he's saying is WWE have written him badly since he left ECW. I think he's also implying that in ECW wrestlers could be themselves, and RVD, yes, he may have been a stoner, but he could really cut some important promos and be the cocky yet lovable rogue that he always was in ECW, and express that in ways far beyond what WWE limited him to later on. I think if he saw what Riddle is doing these days, he'd perhaps count himself a bit lucky to have been given such creative freedom in WWE, because I mean, there's ECW RVD, and then there's WWE RVD, and then there's modern day Matt Riddle right over here in the realm of what is going on creatively there. But it's a really important moment. It's a really important moment, and a lot of it is addressed quite venomously at those main roster superstars up above. But that would pale in comparison to what Paul Heyman had to say. Heyman's promo has gone down in infamy as one of the greatest kind of shooty, yet worked shoot, but kind of shooty promos of all time. Heyman has cut two of the greatest worked shoot promos of all time, and they're both phenomenal. But we're going to talk about this one. The other one was on Vince. It was fantastic as well. This one was just on anybody that he could see, and he just kind of, I like to think this wasn't scripted at all, and he just decided to go out there and think, who can I see up in the balcony, and I'll just let fly towards them. He talks about Edge, who at the time was going through that very real scandal with Lita and Matt Hardy and everything, and Edge's reaction is quite superb as well. He's a very good heel, of course, we all know Edge is, and he like pretends to spit out his beer, or kind of does, and yeah, can we slap a picture of that up please, Owen, actually, to demonstrate what I mean. You've also got Heyman dealing a vicious barb at JBL, saying the only reason you were champion for so long was because Triple H didn't want to work Tuesdays. SmackDown was taped on a Tuesday. Triple H, if he'd been there, Heyman's implying, would have been the champion, and JBL would have got nowhere near that title. The crowd, by the way, are absolutely eating this up. Of course they are. They probably thought they'd never see anything like this again, and now they're seeing it unfold before their eyes. And yes, it's slightly less legitimate because ECW was under the WWE banner at the time, but I feel like there was a lot of real tension in the arena that night between various different wrestlers and figures from the two different sides. And that was proven by the now infamous JBL and Blue Meanie moment. There they are, the pair of them. Look at them. In that photo there, they look like the best of friends. And that is not what happened in 2005. Basically what happened, if you've never seen it, there's a big brawl at the end of the show, which I'll talk about in a few moments time anyway, but all the ECW guys are brawling with all the Raw and SmackDown guys, and everyone's going crazy, and it's really, really fun. It's not fun for the Blue Meanie, because JBL, for whatever reason, decides to single him out and beat him up for real, and he busts his face wide open, and it's a genuinely very unsavoury moment in the history of pro wrestling. But despite that, Meanie would get a measure of revenge a week or two later, or his stablemate Stevie Richards would get it for him, blasting JBL with a terrifying unprotected chair shot. But what I'm using this to demonstrate is the fact that I think, not just confined to JBL, it felt like a lot of these insults flying back and forth, and a lot of the mockery from the main roster guys down to the ECW guys, and a lot of the vitriol and rebellious nature of the ECW guys towards those main roster guys, I feel like a lot of that was just a little bit real. There's a sense that it's real. I know wrestling's all about the art of the illusion and the art of, the very fabric of wrestling is making things seem real when they are not. But when you watch it, you can just tell when someone's actually speaking from the heart and when someone's actually angry. And I think this show is full of it. And honestly, as weird as it sounds, that's one of the reasons why it's one of the greatest pay-per-views of all time, in my opinion. It's not a nice thing. It's not even a good thing. They're not being good role models in this show for the kids. But I don't care, because ECW is not for the kids, and the hatred makes this show what it is. That's a bit of a bad opinion for me to have, but I've kind of got to stand by it because it's true. Let's brighten things up a little bit with our fifth and final reason, what I'm going to call a joyous Finale. The main event of the show is Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley taking on Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman, four incredibly crucial figures in ECW history. I mentioned the whole nostalgia thing in point number 2. This was that, but taken to like a next level. In ECW, the Dudleys were some of the best heels in all of wrestling, and Bubba Ray almost incited riots at times with some of his infamous promos from that day and age. And then you've got Tommy Dreamer, who's kind of the heart and soul of ECW, so he's the perfect person to face off against them. And then you've got the Sandman, who, if Dreamer's the heart and soul, Sandman's like the grimy, disgusting underbelly spirit of ECW. Not underbelly, like overbelly, I guess. Is that a word? Because they never tried to hide that horrible dirtiness. And Sandman's entrance is, of course, arguably the best moment of the entire show. It is a fantastic moment. It's a shame if you can find the version where it's the original Enter Sandman theme over the top of it, not something that's been dubbed later on, then watch that one, because man, what an outstanding moment. I should point out though, I'm calling it a joyous finale, but joyous doesn't necessarily mean perfect. Again, this was another very ragged, kind of sloppy and very chaotic match between the two tag teams and between the various different people who got involved. And for everything amazing that happened in this match, something bad happened as well. You've got, for example, the whole double DDT spot with Tommy Dreamer and Beulah McGillicuddy getting involved as well, and that's just hilariously mistimed. It looks awful, but the crowd don't care. That's the beautiful thing about it. They're still stoked to see her, and they're still cheering massively when she kind of drops her opponent with kind of a DDT at the very wrong time. But it's fine, because no one cares. The reason I said her opponent there is because I can't remember if it was Bubba Ray or Devon, but I'm pretty sure it's Bubba Ray, and I think he just planks before she's even hit him with the... yeah. Other things that go wrong in this finale as well. Dreamer arguably gets bust way too far open, way too early, although I suspect he would argue otherwise. And of course, we've got the previously mentioned JBL and Blue Meanie shoot fight, which is actually just a bit of a disgraceful moment, isn't it? Also, I've met Blue Meanie, and he is such a lovely guy. He's like the nicest guy. But that's stereotypical ECW, isn't it? No discernible flow to the match, things going wrong all over the place from time to time, and yet it's carried through by this incredible violent spirit backed by that incredibly vociferous crowd. That's Extreme Championship Wrestling. It is pure junk food wrestling, but don't we all love junk food from time to time, especially if we haven't had it for about 5 years prior to this meal of junk food. The metaphor fell away towards the end there. But when I say the finale is joyous, it is absolutely joyous. That it's such an incredible... it's goosebump raising. At like every few minutes towards the end of the show, there's something else that happens to make you go, wow, can this get any better? So you've got the Dudleys getting the win with an incredible flaming table spot, helped out by Spike Dudley, who pops up for a big cheer as well, even though he was a heel. We all love Spike Dudley. Then you've got Sandman fighting off the heels at the end and then screaming for a beer. And who dishes out the beers in WWE? Who phones up the beers? Not Roman Reigns. The pioneer of that was obviously Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was in ECW, not for that long. No, he was in ECW. He counts. Any excuse to get Steve Austin on a show. And in fact, the ECW fans are buzzing to see Austin, not just because it's Austin, but I suspect because he was quite the shoot artist himself when he was in ECW, airing his gripes with WCW, who ECW traditionally hate even more than they hate WWE. So you've got Austin, he invites the Raw and SmackDown guys down to the ring for that big brawl that I talked about, but just before the brawl starts, you've got Angle, who's ready to go, like he's seething. And then we get Taz coming out from nowhere to slap on the Taz mission, and everyone loses their minds even more. It's just moment on moment on moment on moment. The ending of the show does not hold back. It's fairly ludicrous, but in the best possible way. The ECW guys clear the ring, and it's Eric Bischoff who's the big fall guy at the end. Remember, they hate WCW. Austin manages to get revenge on the man who fired him from WCW, and the show ends on a big happy note. Not just an emotional happy note for the good guys, but also a bit of an FU to someone they deem a bad guy. Because it wouldn't be ECW without a happy ending, largely featuring somebody getting something nasty happen to them, if that makes sense. On the whole, a wild, chaotic, terrifying at times, very controversial at times, not that great in terms of action, but fantastic in terms of action show that I honestly think goes down as one of the best pay-per-views of all time. An amazing pay-per-view doesn't necessarily have to have amazing wrestling all the way through, it just has to make you feel something. And pound for pound, this show probably makes you feel something more than any other pay-per-view I can think of off the top of my head. Thanks very much for watching, and if you're watching this, right, and you're not familiar with Craig David, give him a listen. wait until it's a sunny day, stick him on, and have a bit of a drive around. Craig David's the spirit of ECW, and I stand by that.